By placing the story in December 1937, it immediately grounds the narrative in a real historical moment. The introduction makes it clear that what happened in Nanjing was not a minor wartime incident, but a large-scale human tragedy. It emphasizes suffering, loss of life, and the collapse of moral boundaries, signaling that this is a story about civilians and humanity, not just armies and battles. The purpose of this chapter is to ensure the audience understands that this history matters and deserves attention and respect. Background: why China and Japan were at war. This chapter explains the political and military context that led to the tragedy. In the early 20th century, Japan was rapidly industrializing and expanding its influence in Asia. Seeking natural resources and regional dominance, Japan occupied Manchuria in 1931 and later moved deeper into China. China, at the time, was politically divided and militarily weaker, but it resisted Japanese expansion. These tensions escalated into the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. This background is essential because it explains why Japanese troops were present in China and how long-standing imperial ambitions and regional instability created the conditions for extreme violence. After intense fighting, Japanese forces defeated Chinese defenses and entered the city. Many Chinese soldiers retreated or became separated from their units, leaving the city largely undefended. Hundreds of thousands of civilians remained trapped inside, unable to flee in time. The fall of a capital city is always chaotic, and in Nanjing, this collapse created fear, confusion, and vulnerability. This chapter explains how the breakdown of military order and the presence of a large civilian population set the stage for what followed. Not a normal occupation. Here, the narrative explains why the situation in Nanjing was different from typical military occupations. In many cases, occupying forces impose curfews, establish order, and manage civilian life. In Nanjing, however, discipline collapsed. Instead of stability, the city experienced widespread violence, terror, and lawlessness. Killings, sexual violence, looting, and arson occurred across large parts of the city. This chapter is crucial because it distinguishes the Nanjing Massacre from normal wartime suffering and shows that the violence was extreme, uncontrolled, and systematic. The massacre begins. This chapter describes how violence escalated into mass killing. Japanese troops targeted not only remaining soldiers, but also civilians. Prisoners of war were executed rather than detained, violating basic rules of warfare. Civilians, especially men suspected of being soldiers in disguise, were rounded up and killed. In many cases, large groups were executed together. Bodies were disposed of in rivers or burned, sometimes to clear areas and sometimes to hide the scale of the killings. This chapter emphasizes that the massacre was not accidental or limited to combat, but involved deliberate violence against non-combatants. Looting and destruction. This chapter explains how everyday life in Nanjing collapsed completely. Soldiers looted homes, stealing food, valuables, and personal belongings. Entire neighborhoods were burned or destroyed, leaving civilians without shelter. Looting and arson increased fear and forced people to flee or hide. This destruction compounded the suffering caused by killings and violence, as families lost not only loved ones, but also homes, possessions, and any sense of safety. The chapter shows how physical destruction deepened the humanitarian disaster. Sexual violence. This chapter addresses one of the most painful and disturbing aspects of the massacre. Sexual violence was widespread and affected women and girls of all ages. These acts were not isolated incidents, but occurred repeatedly throughout the city over an extended period. In many cases, victims were killed afterward to prevent them from speaking. Historically, sexual violence in such atrocities is used as a tool of terror, humiliation, and control, aimed at breaking families and communities. This chapter must be presented carefully, focusing on scale and impact rather than graphic detail, to maintain respect and historical integrity. Death toll. This chapter discusses the number of victims and why it remains debated. Due to wartime chaos, destroyed records, mass burials, and differing definitions of the affected area and time period, an exact number is impossible to determine. Estimates generally range from 100,000 to 300,000 deaths. While governments and scholars may disagree on specific figures, there is broad agreement that the massacre occurred on a massive scale. This chapter helps viewers understand both the enormity of the tragedy and the challenges historians face in documenting such events. International witnesses in the safety zone. This chapter explains how much of what we know about the massacre comes from foreign witnesses. Missionaries, doctors, and diplomats from Western countries were present in Nanjing at the time. They documented events in diaries, letters, and photographs, often writing while the violence was still ongoing. These witnesses also established the Nanjing Safety Zone, an area intended to protect civilians. More than 200,000 people found refuge there, and countless lives were saved. This chapter highlights both the importance of eyewitness evidence and acts of humanity amid widespread cruelty. Aftermath and war crimes trials. This chapter looks at what happened after World War II ended. Japanese military leaders were tried in post-war tribunals for war crimes committed across Asia, including actions related to Nanjing. Some individuals were convicted and punished, while others avoided accountability. The inclusion of this chapter is important because it shows that the massacre was recognized in legal and historical records, not simply claimed years later. It also demonstrates the difficulty of achieving full justice after large-scale atrocities. Denial and controversy. This chapter explains why the Nanjing Massacre remains controversial today. In Japan, public opinion varies. Many acknowledge the massacre, some debate the scale, and a small number deny or minimize it. In China, the event is a central part of national historical memory and education. Political tensions between the two countries have influenced how the history is discussed. This chapter teaches viewers that history is not only about facts, but also about memory, politics, and how societies choose to confront or avoid their past. Why this history matters. This chapter connects the events of Nanjing to broader human lessons. It shows how dehumanization, extreme nationalism, and lack of accountability can lead to mass violence. When civilians are treated as enemies and propaganda removes empathy, moral limits collapse. Remembering Nanjing is not about blaming modern generations, but about recognizing warning signs that can appear anywhere. This chapter transforms history into a lesson meant to prevent future atrocities. Conclusion, memory, and responsibility. The final chapter focuses on remembrance and responsibility. It reminds the audience that while history cannot be changed, it must be remembered honestly. Many victims of the Nanjing Massacre were silenced, leaving others to speak for them. Remembering their suffering honors their lives and reinforces the importance of truth. The conclusion emphasizes that remembrance is not hatred or revenge, but accountability, respect, and a commitment to preventing similar tragedies in the future.